Pay very close attention, because what's unfolding in the Middle East right now isn't just a regional war between America and Iran. It's the opening move in a global power confrontation that could reshape the international order for decades, or trigger a conflict between nuclear superpowers that makes World War II look contained by comparison. March 10th, 2026, day 11 of Operation Epic Fury. And behind the headlines about missiles and oil prices and civilian casualties, a far more dangerous game is playing out involving three of the world's most powerful nations, positioning themselves for what comes next. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi has held intensive phone calls with counterparts from Russia, Iran, France, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE over the past week, articulating a position that puts Beijing in direct opposition to Washington's military intervention. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning stated unequivocally that the U.S.-Israeli strikes have no UN Security Council authorization and violate international law, that China firmly opposes and strongly condemns the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, and that major countries should not make use of their military advantages to arbitrarily attack other countries. Those aren't diplomatic pleasantries. Those are accusations that America is behaving as a rogue state, violating the most fundamental principles of sovereignty. Russia's response has been more calculated but equally significant. President Vladimir Putin called Khamenei's assassination a cynical violation of all norms of human morals. Russian Ambassador Vasily Nebenzia accused the United States at an emergency UN Security Council meeting of yet another unprovoked act of armed aggression. And while neither Moscow nor Beijing has offered direct military intervention, both are providing Iran with something potentially more valuable: diplomatic cover at the UN, intelligence sharing that helps Iran track American warships, and the clear message to Washington that further escalation risks confrontation with powers that can actually fight back. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi issued a warning to the United States after American submarines sank the Iranian warship IRIS Dena off Sri Lanka, killing 104 sailors. Mark my words, the U.S. will come to bitterly regret the precedent it has set. That language, bitterly regretted, wasn't Araghchi's invention. It echoed Chinese diplomatic statements from earlier in the week. Beijing is signaling through Tehran that America's willingness to sink Iranian vessels in international waters 2,000 miles from any combat zone establishes precedents that China could invoke in the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, or anywhere American and Chinese naval forces operate in proximity. I'm going to show you the strategic calculations driving China and Russia's responses to this war, and why both powers see American intervention in Iran as simultaneously threatening their interests and creating opportunities they can exploit. The intelligence and technology transfers that Moscow and Beijing are providing Tehran despite their public restraint, and why those transfers matter more than direct military intervention would. How this conflict is accelerating the formation of an anti-American bloc that includes China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, four nuclear-armed powers coordinating opposition to what they call Western hegemony. The economic weapons China holds include rare earth export bans that could cripple American weapons production, and why Beijing is more likely to use those leverage points than send troops. And why the most dangerous outcome isn't that China or Russia intervenes directly, but that this war creates so much chaos, uncertainty, and weapons depletion that it emboldens aggression in Ukraine, Taiwan, or other flashpoints where American deterrence suddenly looks weaker. This is how regional wars become global conflicts, not through deliberate escalation, but through miscalculation, through adversaries testing limits during moments when they perceive weakness or distraction. And right now, America is burning through missile stockpiles in the Persian Gulf that it might desperately need in the Pacific or Eastern Europe in the next 6 months. Hit subscribe now, because if we're watching the formation of a China-Russia-Iran axis that could challenge American global power for the next generation, you'll need analysis that goes beyond daily casualty counts. The Chinese government's public statements reveal a carefully calibrated strategy designed to oppose American intervention without triggering direct confrontation. When asked whether China and Russia are considering providing military support to Iran, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning declined to answer directly, saying only, "I have no more information to add beyond the official readout of Foreign Minister Wang Yi's call with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov." That non-answer is itself revealing. Beijing isn't ruling out military assistance. It's keeping options open while avoiding commitments that would force immediate American response. What China is providing is something potentially more valuable than weapons: diplomatic legitimacy for Iran's position at international forums. Wang Yi stressed in multiple calls with foreign counterparts that purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be observed and arbitrary use of force in international relations should be rejected, language that frames America as the aggressor violating international law rather than Iran as a nuclear proliferator getting what it deserves. At the UN Security Council emergency session, requested jointly by China and Russia, Beijing's representative condemned the strikes and called for immediate cessation of military operations, creating a formal record that this intervention lacks international legal authority. China is also evacuating its citizens from Iran in numbers that suggest Beijing expects prolonged conflict, regardless of what diplomatic statements say about desires for peace. As of March 2nd, more than 3,000 Chinese nationals had been evacuated from Iran, according to foreign ministry statements, with Chinese diplomatic missions in neighboring countries sending working groups to border crossings to assist evacuees. That's not the behavior of a government confident this war ends quickly. That's contingency planning for sustained instability that could last months or years. The economic calculations driving Chinese restraint are brutally pragmatic. Nearly all of Iran's crude oil exports, which account for roughly 13% of China's total seaborne crude intake, flow to Chinese refineries through networks of vessels that route Iranian oil through intermediary countries to avoid sanctions. That trade relationship is valuable, but not irreplaceable. China imports oil from dozens of sources and has strategic reserves sufficient to cushion short-term disruptions. Losing Iranian supply would hurt, but wouldn't cripple China's economy the way it would have a decade ago, when energy security was more precarious. More importantly, China has strategic priorities that rank above defending Iran. President Xi Jinping is scheduled to host President Trump in Beijing later this month for a summit where trade, Taiwan, and technology transfer restrictions will dominate the agenda. Undermining that summit by providing overt military support to Iran would sacrifice potential gains on issues China cares about more. As Ahmed Abudu, a fellow at London's Chatham House Policy Institute, told media, Beijing may seek concessions on issues more directly related to its interests, such as Taiwan and trade, in exchange for its significantly watered-down messaging on Iran. Comment pragmatic. If you think China is making the right strategic choice prioritizing Taiwan and trade over defending Iran, or betrayal if you think abandoning an ally proves Chinese partnerships are worthless. But beneath the public restraint, China is providing Iran with capabilities that could prove decisive in a prolonged conflict. Beijing has supplied Iran with dual-use technologies that have both civilian and military applications, including satellite launch services that help Tehran surveil military targets across the region. Iran increasingly relies on Chinese-supplied components for its missile program, its surveillance infrastructure, and its domestic communications networks. And while China officially maintains that all trade with Iran complies with international law, the reality is that Chinese firms are providing the industrial base that keeps Iran's military functioning despite decades of Western sanctions. The intelligence dimension may be even more significant. Reports indicate China is sharing real-time satellite intelligence and signal data with Iran to help track movements of U.S. warships in the Persian Gulf and Indian Ocean. That's the kind of assistance that doesn't generate headlines but fundamentally changes operational calculations. If Iranian commanders know where American aircraft carriers are positioned, when submarines surface which bases are launching strike aircraft, they can time their retaliatory attacks for maximum effect. The IRGC's ability to launch coordinated strikes on 27 American bases simultaneously suggests intelligence coordination far beyond what Iran's domestic surveillance could achieve alone. Russia's role is even more direct, despite Moscow's rhetorical caution about avoiding military entanglement. The Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty Russia and Iran signed in January 2025 doesn't formally commit Russia to mutual military assistance, and Kremlin officials were careful to emphasize that distinction when the agreement was announced. But in practice, Russia has become Iran's most important source of military technology, electronic warfare capabilities, and diplomatic cover at international forums where Moscow's permanent UN Security Council seat gives it veto power over any resolution condemning Iranian actions. Putin is benefiting from this war in ways that don't require Russian troops deploying to the Middle East. Oil prices surging from $70 before the conflict to peaks above $119 provide enormous relief to Russia's war-strained budget. Every dollar increase in oil prices translates to billions in additional revenue for the Russian government, money that can fund continued operations in Ukraine, where the war has ground into a brutal stalemate consuming extraordinary resources. Ellen Wald, president of Transversal Consulting, told CNBC, Putin's got to be thrilled because anything that raises the price of oil is good for him. If you can't get oil from the Gulf, hey, we've got a great supply. The strategic distraction matters almost as much as the economic windfall. Every American missile fired at Iranian targets is one fewer available for potential use supporting Ukraine. Every bomber hour logged over Iran is capacity unavailable for deterrence missions in Eastern Europe. Every intelligence asset focused on tracking Iranian commanders is diverted from Russian military movements. Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, who sits on the Senate Armed Services Committee, expressed exactly this concern to Time magazine. I am deeply concerned about Ukraine. Just as a matter of common sense, our resources and supplies are limited, and I think we will be hard-pressed at some point to tell Ukraine what is coming. Share this video if you think Putin is winning this war without firing a shot by watching America exhaust itself in the Middle East. Russia is also providing Iran with capabilities that could prove critical if this conflict continues for months. Moscow has supplied electronic warfare systems that help Iran jam communications and disrupt guidance systems on incoming missiles. Russian satellite intelligence helps Iranian commanders track American and Israeli military movements. Counter-satellite communication systems reportedly supplied by Russia last month allow Iran to interfere with coalition command networks. And Russian armored vehicles, including Spartak models, have been identified in Iranian security forces' suppression of domestic protests that erupted after Khamenei's death. Most concerning from an American strategic perspective is Russia's historical role in Iran's nuclear program. Russia built Iran's Bushehr nuclear reactor and has provided technical assistance to Iran's civilian nuclear program since the mid-1990s. Financial Times reported in 2024 that Iranian defense-linked scientists made 2 covert trips to Russia to obtain dual-use technologies with potential nuclear weapons applications. If this war continues and Iran decides that the only guarantee of regime survival is a nuclear deterrent, Russian technical assistance could dramatically accelerate Tehran's path to a working weapon. That would transform this conflict from a regional military operation into a nuclear proliferation crisis with global implications. The formation of what some analysts are calling an anti-American axis became visually undeniable at China's Victory Day parade in Beijing in September 2025. President Xi Jinping stood flanked by Russian President Vladimir Putin and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in Tiananmen Square reviewing Chinese military forces, a startling display of unity among 3 nuclear-armed autocracies that share opposition to American global leadership. That image wasn't symbolic theater. It represented growing military coordination, including joint naval drills involving all 3 nations, technology transfers that help each power develop capabilities the others possess, and diplomatic coordination at the UN and other international bodies where they vote as a bloc on issues challenging Western interests. Iran's integration into this grouping adds a 4th member with unique capabilities in asymmetric warfare, ballistic missiles, and regional proxy networks spanning from Lebanon to Yemen. While Iran isn't nuclear armed yet, its threshold status as a nation capable of building weapons within months, if it chose to cross that line, gives it leverage disproportionate to its conventional military power. The combination of Chinese economic might, Russian military technology, and UN Security Council veto, North Korean weapons manufacturing at scale, and Iranian regional influence creates a partnership that can challenge American hegemony in ways no single power could achieve alone. China holds economic leverage over the United States that it has barely begun to employ, but could deploy devastatingly if Beijing decides Iran matters enough to risk broader confrontation. The most obvious weapon is rare earth elements, minerals critical for manufacturing everything from smartphone screens to missile guidance systems to fighter jet components. China controls roughly 70% of global rare earth mining and 90% of processing capacity. Beijing announced in December that it would bar the export of rare earth elements for military use, creating potential bottlenecks in American weapons production at exactly the moment when the Pentagon is burning through missile stockpiles in the Persian Gulf. A sustained campaign in Iran could deplete American air defense interceptors, precision-guided munitions, and cruise missiles to levels that create vulnerabilities elsewhere. If China decides to test American resolve over Taiwan, while U.S. forces are focused on Iran and weapons inventories are depleted, the calculation shifts dramatically. American deterrence depends on credible capacity to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. But if Pacific Fleet assets are supporting Gulf operations, if missile stocks are exhausted targeting Iranian infrastructure, if surveillance satellites are repositioned to watch Tehran instead of Beijing, then the window for Chinese action that might have seemed impossible suddenly becomes thinkable. The same logic applies to Russian calculations about Ukraine. If American attention and resources are consumed by Iran, if European allies are preoccupied with Middle East spillover, including terrorism threats and refugee flows, if weapons supplies that might have supported Ukrainian forces are instead being used to bomb Iranian cities, then Putin might conclude this is the moment to push for decisive gains before Western focus returns to Eastern Europe. Wars create opportunities for adversaries to exploit distraction and overstretched militaries in ways that peacetime never permits. The most dangerous scenarios aren't those where China or Russia intervenes directly in Iran. Beijing and Moscow are too strategically sophisticated to risk military confrontation with the United States over a peripheral ally when far more important interests are at stake closer to home. The danger is that this war creates conditions through weapons depletion, strategic distraction, economic disruption, and demonstrated American overreach that embolden Chinese or Russian aggression in regions where they have core interests and see opportunities created by American exhaustion. Taiwan represents the clearest risk. If Chinese military planners assess that American Pacific forces are degraded by Iran operations, that missile defense systems are depleted, that political will for another simultaneous conflict is absent, they might conclude the window for unification by force has opened. The same logic applies to Russian calculations about seizing more Ukrainian territory or threatening NATO's eastern flank. These aren't hypothetical concerns. They're the stated assessments of American military commanders who understand that global deterrence operates as an interconnected system where weakness demonstrated in one theater invites testing in others. Yet neither China nor Russia wants to see Iran completely destroyed or replaced by an American-aligned government. A new Iranian regime that pivoted away from Moscow and Beijing would eliminate Russian leverage in the Middle East and cut off Chinese oil supplies. Regional instability or civil war in Iran would jeopardize the transit routes that Russia uses to move goods and energy, since European options closed after the Ukraine invasion. As Hanna Nata, director of the Eurasia Non-Proliferation Program at the Middlebury Institute, wrote after Khamenei's death, Russia's entire Middle East policy has been predicated on balancing between Iran and its adversaries. Its ties with Iran gave Russia leverage with Israel and Gulf Arab states. With a new Iran, Russia could lose this role. So the strategy both powers are pursuing is to provide enough support to prevent Iranian collapse while avoiding direct involvement that would trigger American military response. They condemn the strikes at the UN. They share intelligence that helps Iran fight more effectively. They provide diplomatic legitimacy for Iranian resistance. They exploit economic opportunities created by oil price spikes and weapons demand. And they watch carefully to see whether American power is as dominant as Washington claims, or whether overstretch and resource limitations create openings to challenge American hegemony in regions that matter more to Beijing and Moscow than Tehran does. The Ukrainian angle deserves special attention because it reveals how interconnected these conflicts have become. Iran provided Russia with valuable Shahed combat drones early in the Ukraine war. Technology Moscow has since adapted and now manufactures domestically. Iran supplied roughly 1 million rounds of ammunition and 300,000 artillery shells to Russia, according to intelligence assessments, munitions that enabled Russian forces to sustain bombardment campaigns that Ukrainian defenses struggled to counter. If Iranian support is lost because the regime collapses or pivots away from Moscow, analysts expect Beijing and Pyongyang to compensate, with China increasing economic support, while North Korea increases weapons supplies. The result would be a tightening of the China-Russia-North Korea partnership that first became visible at the September 2025 Beijing parade. The irony that shouldn't be lost on anyone is that American intervention in Iran, sold as necessary to prevent nuclear proliferation and regional aggression, might actually accelerate the formation of exactly the kind of anti-American bloc that makes future conflicts more likely and more dangerous. By demonstrating willingness to assassinate foreign leaders, sink warships in international waters, and wage unlimited war on nations that challenge American preferences, Washington is providing Beijing and Moscow with evidence for their argument that only hard power and territorial control provide security, not diplomatic agreements or international law. Putin reportedly was deeply affected by Muammar Gaddafi's death at the hands of Libyan rebels during NATO's 2011 intervention. He now has fresh evidence from Venezuela, where American special forces captured President Nicolas Maduro, and from Iran, where bombs killed the supreme leader, that American presidents are willing to remove foreign leaders they don't like, regardless of international law. That perception makes negotiated settlements to the Ukraine war less likely, because why would Putin trust American security guarantees when he's watched two leaders who cut deals with Washington get removed anyway? I've shown you China's carefully calibrated strategy of diplomatic opposition combined with practical restraint driven by higher priorities on Taiwan and trade. Russia's calculation that this war benefits Moscow economically through higher oil prices and strategically through American distraction from Ukraine without requiring Russian military involvement. The intelligence and technology transfers both powers are providing Iran, despite public caution about direct intervention. How the China, Russia, Iran, North Korea axis is forming into a genuine counterweight to American power with capabilities to challenge Western hegemony regionally, if not yet globally. The economic weapons China holds include rare earth export restrictions that could cripple American weapons production. And why the greatest danger isn't direct intervention, but that this war depletes American military capacity and attention in ways that invite aggression in Taiwan, Ukraine, or other flashpoints where adversaries see opportunity in American exhaustion. March 10th, 2026 isn't just day 11 of a Middle East conflict. It's a stress test of American global power that China and Russia are watching intently to determine whether Washington can sustain military operations on multiple fronts, or whether overreach creates openings to challenge American dominance in regions both powers care about far more than Iran. Subscribe immediately. Enable all notifications, because the great power competition defining this century is playing out in the shadows of the Iran war, and understanding those dynamics matters more than daily battle updates. The missiles, the casualties, the oil prices, all of that is surface-level noise compared to the deeper question of whether America's era of uncontested global military supremacy is ending not through dramatic defeat, but through exhaustion, overextension, and strategic miscalculation that invites challenges from powers that have been waiting for exactly this moment. Here's your question. Comment A if you think China and Russia are making strategic mistakes by not defending Iran more aggressively. Comment B if you think their restraint shows smart prioritization of core interests over peripheral allies. Comment C if you think this war accelerates World War III, regardless of whether Beijing and Moscow intend it to. The path forward depends on whether anyone in Washington, Beijing, or Moscow is thinking beyond the immediate conflict to where these cascading consequences lead. The question is whether wisdom prevails or whether we're sleepwalking into catastrophe one calculated decision at a time.